"Riley!" Mark called out, stumbling through the dark apartment. The scratching grew more intense. When he reached the back door, his heart sank. It stood wide open, rain and wind whipping through the gap. "Riley!" Mark rushed outside in his pajamas, instantly soaked by the downpour. "Riley!" he shouted again, his voice nearly lost in the storm. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the empty street. The brief burst of light showed him nothing but rain-slicked pavement and swaying trees. "Riley, come back!" Mark's calls grew more desperate as he ran down the street, checking behind parked cars and in dark corners. But the German shepherd had vanished into the night. Through the storm-swept city, Riley ran with single-minded determination, his paws splashing through puddles as he kept his nose to the ground, following a scent trail that had nearly faded with time. Cars honked as he darted between them, headlights cutting through the rain like bright knives. His fur was soaked, but he didn't slow down. Every stride, every turn, every careful sniff of the air brought him closer to his destination. The airport. The place where he'd last seen Evan walk through those glass doors. When Riley finally reached Terminal C, the first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples. His fur was matted and dripping, leaving muddy paw prints on the concrete. But his eyes remained alert, fixed on the terminal entrance, his unwavering vigil just beginning. The morning sun crept over the airport horizon, bringing with it a surge of activity. Riley's ears twitched at the familiar symphony of rolling suitcases, clicking heels, and car horns. The scent of breakfast sandwiches and coffee wafted from the terminal, making his empty stomach growl loudly. Despite his hunger, Riley stayed, rooted to his spot near Terminal C's entrance. His fur was still damp from the morning dew, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the sliding glass doors, watching each person who walked through. A security guard in a crisp blue uniform approached, his boots clicking against the concrete. "Hey, get out of here!" He clapped his hands loudly, the sharp sound echoing off the terminal walls. Riley stood up slowly, backing away a few steps before sitting down again, his gaze steady and determined. The guard threw up his hands. "Stubborn dog," he muttered, shaking his head as he walked away. As the morning rush picked up, travelers began to take notice of the quiet German shepherd. A businessman in a dark suit paused mid-bite of his breakfast sandwich, looking from his food to Riley. After a moment's hesitation, he broke off half and tossed it over. Riley ate it quickly, but his eyes never left the terminal doors for long. A flight attendant pulling her wheeled suitcase stopped to scratch behind his ears. "Poor thing," she said softly, her gentle touch reminding Riley of easier days. But as soon as she walked away, his focus returned to his vigil. Hours passed, and Riley became part of the terminal's landscape. Regular airport workers grew, used to his presence. Some would nod in his direction, others would leave scraps of food, but all seemed to sense there was something special about his patient watchfulness. By late afternoon, Maria appeared again. Her orange safety vest was bright against the gray terminal walls. This time she carried 2 bowls, one filled with water, the other with brown kibble. She set them down carefully near Riley. "You're really not leaving, huh?" she murmured, crouching beside him. Riley turned his head to look at her, his brown eyes deep and knowing before returning his gaze to the terminal doors. Still waiting. Days blurred into weeks, the airport turning into Riley's world. His routine had become predictable, patrolling the perimeter of Terminal C in the early morning hours when the crowds were thin, then returning to his post near the sliding doors. He watched each plane land, his ears perking up at the roar of engines before settling down again. Airport staff had fully embraced him. Security guards who once shooed him away now greeted him with gentle pats. Maria brought him fresh water twice during her shifts. The coffee cart workers saved him bits of breakfast sandwiches. When the first cold snap hit, a flight attendant named Jenny brought a thick blue blanket from home. "Here you go, Sergeant," she said softly, laying it near his usual spot. Riley sniffed it carefully before settling onto its warmth. One sunny afternoon, Maria sat down on the concrete next to Riley during her lunch break. She unwrapped her sandwich, tearing off a piece for him. As she watched him eat, her eyes fell on his worn collar. "Military style, huh?" she murmured, letting her fingers trace the tough fabric. Riley didn't flinch. He'd grown to trust her gentle presence. Maria smiled. "You look like a tough guy. I'm calling you Sergeant." Riley's ears twitched at the name, and Maria laughed. "Yeah, that fits you perfectly." The nickname spread quickly through the airport staff. "Morning, Sergeant," the baggage handlers would call out. "At ease, Sergeant," the security. Guards would joke as they passed by. Even regular travelers began to recognize him, pointing him out to their children. "Look, there's Sergeant." One afternoon, a young woman with a pink phone case stopped to take Riley's picture as he lay in his usual spot, head held high, watching the terminal doors. She typed quickly on her phone, then walked away. Hours later, Maria was scrolling through her social media feed when she saw the photo. There was Riley, looking noble and patient, with the caption, "This dog has been sitting at the airport for weeks. Who is he waiting for?" The post was already gathering attention. Comments poured in, people sharing their own photos of Riley, and asking questions about the mysterious dog who never left his post. Maria walked over to where Riley lay, his eyes fixed as always on the terminal doors. She knelt beside him, giving him a gentle pat. "Looks like you're famous now, Sergeant," she said softly. Riley glanced at her briefly before returning to his watchful vigil, seemingly uninterested in his growing internet fame. The year shifted like passengers through the terminal. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's chill, and still, Riley remained. His once glossy coat had dulled, streaked with gray and dirt that even the rain couldn't wash away. His ribs showed more prominently now, despite the regular meals from kind-hearted staff members. Yet his eyes never lost their spark of hope. Each morning, he'd lift his head at the sound of the first arrival, scanning faces in the crowd. Each night, he'd curl up in his spot, waiting for tomorrow. The airport. Community had fully embraced him. Security guards no longer tried to chase him away, and the maintenance crew left their door propped open on cold nights, providing him shelter from the wind. Even the coffee shop workers saved their leftover breakfast sandwiches for him. One crisp morning, a man in a pressed suit noticed Riley during his layover. Sam Harper, a journalist known for human interest stories, watched as the German Shepherd maintained his silent vigil. Something about the dog's unwavering presence touched him. "How long has he been here?" Sam asked Maria, who was passing by with her luggage cart. 6 years now," she replied, her voice soft with concern. "He never really leaves Terminal C." Sam spent his 3-hour layover talking to airport staff, gathering their stories about Riley. He learned about the dog's quiet resilience and his mysterious, unbreakable loyalty. And Sam knew there was something special about this dog's tale, something the world needed to hear. Riley, the loyal German Shepherd, remained steadfast at Gate 12, his military collar a silent testament to his unwavering dedication. Day after day, countless travelers tried to coax him away from his vigil, but Riley never budged. He stayed put, waiting for the one person who never returned. The next morning, Sam Harper's article appeared both in print and online. The Dog at Gate 12, 6 years of waiting, painted a touching portrait of Riley's devotion and the small community that had formed around him. Sunlight poured through the terminal windows as Riley lay in his usual spot, ears perking up at the familiar cadence of military boots against the pavement. Hope flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't Evan. Riley's tail, which had begun to rise, drooped again as he let out a soft sigh, lowering his head back onto his paws. In his cluttered office, Sam leaned back in his chair, his coffee long gone cold. The story he'd written felt different from any other, raw, real, and profoundly moving. With a deep breath, he clicked publish. Within hours, the internet buzzed with reactions. Comments poured in, offering adoption or sharing the heartbreak of Riley's loyalty. News stations picked up the story, and soon the world knew of the dog who refused to leave his post. Reporters flocked to the airport, capturing footage of Riley lying patiently near the automatic doors. Maria, one of the airport workers, was interviewed, her voice gentle as she spoke. "We just call him Sergeant now. He's waiting for someone, and I don't think he'll leave until they come." Despite the growing fame, Riley remained unchanged. He ignored the cameras and the visitors, his focus locked on the terminal doors. As social media lit up with stories of devoted pets, concern grew for Riley's well-being. People questioned how long he could keep waiting and whether someone needed to help him move on. One evening, as the terminal quieted, Maria noticed Riley's breaths had grown more labored. She knelt beside him, wrapping a thick blanket around his weary body. "You don't have to keep waiting," she whispered, stroking his graying fur. But Riley's gaze remained fixed ahead, undeterred. Across the world, in a rehabilitation center, Evan Rivera opened his eyes to the harsh fluorescent light. 6 years, lost to injury and memory fog, had changed him. A soldier once full of life, now weathered and uncertain. When the news finally reached him, delivered by Mark in a trembling voice, Evan could hardly believe it. Riley, his dog, had been waiting at the airport all this time. Desperation took hold as Evan raced to the airport. Memories flooded back. Morning walks, Riley's playful bark, and how he'd curl up at his feet every night. What if Riley didn't recognize him now? The fear gnawed at him, but he pushed forward, his heart pounding as he approached terminal. See, there lying near the doors was Riley, older, grayer, but unmistakably his. Evan hesitated, his voice cracking as he called out, "Riley!" At that sound, the voice he had longed for, Riley's ears perked up. Slowly he turned, his nose working the air. Then, with a burst of energy that seemed to defy his age, Riley leapt to his feet, rushing toward Evan with all the spirit of his youth. Tears streamed down Evan's face as he knelt, wrapping his arms around his loyal companion. Riley buried his face in Evan's shoulder, his whole body trembling with joy. The airport fell silent as onlookers watched the reunion unfold, proof that loyalty and love could withstand even the longest waits. For Riley, the vigil was over. He had finally found the one he had waited so long for, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Riley's bark echoed through Terminal A, a joyful sound, part bark, part cry. The younger dog crashed into Evan with such force that his handler tumbled backward onto the floor. Riley's tail whipped back and forth with wild abandon as he pressed himself against Evan's chest, pawing at him and whimpering with uncontained joy. Evan wrapped his arms around Riley's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur as tears streamed down his cheeks. "You waited," he choked out, pressing his forehead against Riley's. "You really waited." Around them, the airport had fallen silent, travelers pausing to watch the heart-wrenching reunion. Maria stood nearby, wiping tears from her cheeks, as if she had always known this moment would come. Mark lingered a few steps back, drawing in a shaky breath as he watched Riley smother Evan's face with frantic, joyous licks. His paws still, pressed against Evan's chest as if making sure his person was truly there. The long wait was finally over. Hours later, the soft glow of a lamp filled Evan's old apartment, casting warm shadows across the worn furniture. Riley lay curled up on the floor between Evan and Mark, his chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful breaths. For the first time in 6 years, the German shepherd slept without stirring at every sound, without keeping one eye on the door. Evan couldn't take his gaze off him, his fingers gently stroking Riley's fur, noting the gray around his muzzle and the slight thinness etched into his frame by the years of waiting. "I should have been here," Evan murmured, his voice heavy with regret. Mark shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "We all thought you were gone," he replied, his own eyes fixed on Riley's sleeping form. His voice cracked slightly. "The reports, they were so sure." Silence hung between them, broken only by Riley's soft snores and the ticking of the clock past midnight. Neither made a move to leave. "Tell me everything," Evan said quietly. "About—" When he ran away, about the airport, Mark leaned forward, rubbing his face as if trying to gather the right words. He knew exactly where he was going, straight back to Terminal C, where he'd last seen you. Nothing I did could make him leave. He just waited, through everything. Rain, snow, summer heat. The airport staff started looking after him, but he never really connected with anyone. Just waited. Evan's shoulders sagged, his heart aching. "I never stopped thinking about him either," he admitted. "Even when I couldn't remember my own name. I had fragments. The feel of fur under my hands, the sound of panting, a tail wagging. Maybe we were both waiting in our own ways." They talked through the night, weaving together the stories of the years they'd lost. How Evan had fought to regain his memories, and how Mark had searched desperately for Riley, and how a small community had formed around the loyal dog who never gave up hope. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the blinds, and Evan dozed on the couch. A familiar sensation pulled him from sleep, a soft whine, followed by the gentle nudge of a cold nose against his palm. Evan opened his eyes to find Riley there, tail wagging slowly, looking at him with complete devotion. "Hey, buddy," Evan whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "We're home." Riley's tail wagged faster at the sound of his voice. When Evan stood, Riley rose too, though his movements were stiffer now, age catching up with him, but his eyes shone with trust and contentment. For the first time in years, he didn't glance at the door. He didn't need to wait anymore. Their new routine settled comfortably around them like an old, familiar coat. Each morning, Riley's gentle nudge woke Evan, and they'd venture out for their walk, shorter now to accommodate Riley's aching joints. The old dog still approached each outing with quiet enthusiasm, pausing often to investigate scents, with his keen nose while Evan waited patiently. Afternoons belonged to the porch, where Evan would settle into his chair with a book, while Riley sprawled beside him in patches of sunlight. Neighbors passing by would wave, and Riley's tail would wag in gentle acknowledgement. At night, there was no more pacing or vigil at the door, only peaceful, contented sleep. One crisp morning, Evan drove them to the airport, Terminal C looking less imposing in the daylight. Riley sat calmly in the passenger seat, ears perked as the familiar building came into view. Maria was there, organizing luggage carts, and her face lit up with recognition when she saw them. "Look who it is," she said warmly, crouching down to give Riley a gentle pat on the head. "Our faithful sergeant." Evan smiled. "I just wanted to thank you for looking after him all those years." Maria nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. "He really never left, huh?" She gestured toward the doors where Riley had kept his endless vigil. Others gathered too, sharing stories of the loyal dog who had become part of their lives, how he'd braved storms, accepted food politely, and never lost hope. Evan listened, his hand resting on Riley's back, understanding that while the dog had waited here, he too had been waiting, through memory loss and rehabilitation, through finding his way home. As they left, Riley turned back to take one last look at the terminal doors, his silent farewell, before following Evan back to the truck. As time passed, Riley grew slower, his fur more silvered, his joints stiffer. One morning, when Evan prepared his breakfast, Riley didn't come padding, in like usual. Alarmed, Evan found him still lying on his bed, breathing labored and struggling to stand. "It's okay, boy," Evan whispered, lifting him gently. "I've got you." Dr. Sarah Martinez at the clinic examined Riley with gentle hands, her eyes kind but somber. His body's worn down, Evan, she said softly. Years of stress and exposure. He's just tired now. On the drive home, Evan kept a hand on Riley's back, promising softly, "We'll make every moment count." One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of colors, Evan sat on the porch with Riley's head resting on his knee. Running his fingers through Riley's fur, he whispered, "I should have come home sooner." Riley gave a contented sigh, pressing closer to Evan's leg. In his simple, loyal world, there was no sense of lost time, only the certainty that his person was there now, and that was enough. When morning broke, Evan prepared breakfast, but the familiar sound of Riley's pause never came. He found his friend still on his bed, eyes open but too tired to move. Carefully, Evan lifted him into the truck and drove to the airport one last time. At Terminal C, Maria and familiar faces gathered, paying quiet respects to the old soldier, who had never given up hope. As the sun dipped low, Evan carried Riley back home, one final journey together. That night, with Riley resting by his side on the porch, Evan whispered, "You did good, buddy. You did real good." Riley's breathing slowed, and as the stars emerged in the night sky, he let out one last peaceful breath, knowing he had fulfilled his vigil and could finally rest. And there, under the watchful sky, Evan sat beside his faithful friend, holding him close as the night stretched on, wrapped in the memory of a love that never falts. Evan's voice was barely more than a whisper as his fingers traced the familiar path behind Riley's ears, finding the spots that always made the old dog's tail thump softly against the porch boards. "Better than I ever deserved," he murmured. The night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden, a garden Riley had watched Evan plant just weeks ago. The dog's eyes were half closed now, peaceful and content, his body pressed against Evan's leg, seeking the warmth and presence of his person. Riley was making sure Evan was still there. Evan kept talking, his voice steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. Each word was filled with years of love, gratitude, and understanding. "You can rest now," he said softly, his hand still stroking Riley's fur. "You did what you came to do." The wind whispered through the trees, gentle and calm, and the stars sparkled overhead, bearing witness to this quiet moment between a man and his faithful friend. In that peaceful silence, with his best friend beside him, Riley took his final breath. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Evan's house in shades of amber and gold. The light spilled across the wooden porch, illuminating the empty space beside Evan's chair where Riley had always sat. The silence felt different now, heavier, more complete. Evan's fingers gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. The morning birds sang their usual songs, but without Riley's ears perking up at their calls, the melody felt hollow. The neighborhood was waking up, cars starting, doors closing, people calling out morning greetings. But on Evan's porch, time stood still. Inside the house, Evan's movements were mechanical. Muscle memory carried him through a routine that suddenly felt foreign. The coffee maker hummed to life, and Evan paused, waiting for the familiar click of paws on hardwood. But there was only silence. Steam rose from his coffee mug as he stepped back onto the porch, his eyes drifting to the spot where Riley had taken his final breath just hours ago. The blanket still lay there, rumpled and empty. Evan's legs felt heavy as he knelt beside it, his hand trembling as it brushed across the soft fabric. Riley's scent lingered, a mixture of outdoors and warmth that had always meant home. The grief hit him in waves, sharp and raw, making his chest tighten and his eyes burn. But beneath the pain was something else, a profound gratitude that made his heart swell. "You waited for me, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll carry you with me now." The morning stretched on, each minute marked by the absence of Riley's presence. No tail thumping against the floor, no gentle whine, asking for breakfast, no warm body leaning against his leg. When Mark's truck pulled up later that day, the sun was high in the sky. He climbed the porch steps slowly, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his shoulders heavy with shared grief. Without a word, he settled into the chair next to Evans. They sat there together, two men bound by loss and love, staring at the quiet road ahead. No words were needed. The empty space beside Evans' chair said more than words ever could. A week passed in a haze, each day blending into the next. When Evans' phone rang that morning, Maria's voice carried a hint of something that made him sit up straighter. "You should come to the airport," she said, her tone warm but serious. The drive to the airport felt different now. No eager companion in the passenger seat, no rhythmic panting filling the silence, just memories and an ache that hadn't quite dulled. As Evan pulled into the familiar parking lot, he noticed a small crowd gathered near Terminal C. Their voices were hushed, respectful, like visitors in a sacred place. Some held phones, taking pictures, while others just stood quietly, looking at something on the wall. Maria waited for him near the entrance, her work vest reflecting the morning sun. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she took his arm. "Come on," she said softly. "There's something you need to see." The crowd parted as they approached, whispers of recognition rippling through the gathered people. Mounted on the wall near the doors where Riley had spent so many days waiting was a bronze plaque. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, every detail perfect. Riley's image was captured beautifully, standing, tall, alert, waiting. His ears were perked forward, his posture proud, just as Evan remembered him. Below the image, words were etched deep and clear. For 6 years, he waited. Love never forgets. Evan's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the cool metal surface, his fingers tracing the outline of Riley's face. His chest tightened with emotion. He'd hate all this attention, Evan managed to chuckle, though his voice was thick with grief. The thought of Riley's modest nature made the moment even more poignant. Maria stood beside him, wiping tears from her cheeks as she smiled. "Maybe," she agreed softly, "but he deserves it." People came and went, some pausing to read the plaque, others snapping pictures, their faces softening with the simple message of loyalty and love. Back in his truck, Evan pulled out Riley's old collar. The worn leather had survived 6 years of waiting, just like Riley had. Without hesitation, Evan stepped out and carefully draped the collar over one corner of the plaque. It hung there, a simple testament to a bond that defied time and distance. Evan turned and walked toward the exit. As he drove home, the autumn wind swept through the open window, ruffling his hair. For the first time in years, his smile felt genuine. Months later, Evan found himself at a shelter's adoption event. He hadn't planned to stop, but something drew him in. Amidst the bustling volunteers and restless dogs, one caught his eye, a medium-sized mixed breed with patchy brown fur and patient eyes. Evan knelt beside her kennel. "Hey there," he said softly. The dog sniffed his fingers before giving them a tentative lick, her tail wagging slowly. A volunteer smiled. "She's been waiting a while. Most people want puppies or purebreds." Evan nodded, his voice steady. "Let's go home." As they walked away, Evan tilted his face toward the sky. The clouds drifted peacefully, white against the blue. For the first time since losing Riley, he felt truly at peace. And somewhere, in a place beyond time,